Hi, I'm Bri, and today I'm going to be talking about these two fantastic Triumph 1200cc motorcycles. I've been really fortunate to have these in my garage for the last couple of weeks, and I've spent plenty of time on both of them and really enjoyed it. So today I'm going to talk through the things I liked, the things I maybe wasn't as keen on, and at the end I'll let you know which one my favourite is, which wasn't the easiest decision to make. But in the order that they arrived, let's start over here with the Speed Twin before we move on to the Thruxton RS. So this is the Stealth model, which means it's got this gorgeous paintwork, which is the limited edition for this year following the chrome editions that they did during last year. So really beautiful design, and as a modern classic, it's slightly more on the sportier side. So initially it looked like it was probably going to be quite, comfortable. I'd imagined it was going to be not dissimilar to something like the Bonneville in that sense, but actually it was a lot more sporty for the riding position than I was expecting, which paired with the power has made it a lot of fun. So this one comes in at just under 100 horsepower, which is slightly lower than the Thruxton, being just over 100, but nonetheless it still has an awful lot of go on it. So last summer I rode the 900, and I quite recently also tested the 400. So I've ridden now the full speed range from the single and both of the larger twins as well. And I have to admit, the thing I was most excited about is that this has more power. And I thought, does that mean it's going to be heavier? Does that mean it's going to be a bit more difficult to maneuver? And honestly, not particularly. It's still been really easy to maneuver around, and the extra power has been very gratefully received. So I mentioned about the riding position, which I can show you now. So for reference, I'm 5'6". So I'm not particularly tall or particularly short. It's propped up on a rock at the moment, so it doesn't fall directly into the field. But you can see how easy it is for me to have my feet fully down. That does mean the bike will look a little bit smaller if you are on the taller side, but it's still fairly generously sized, I would say. So the foot pegs were potentially a little bit further back than I was expecting. Shouldn't have maybe been a surprise, given that it is the Speed. It wasn't going to be a cruiser position. But if you do get your toes up on, they are properly right back. And that was an awful lot of fun. Wrist-wise, you are a little bit more on your kind of arms than just fully sitting back, but maybe that's also down to my height. I do think, if you're a bit taller, and you could definitely sit up upright a little bit more than I was. So as far as the power delivery goes, I've seen some people talk about throttle play and the need for potentially adding a spacer in the throttle to make the power delivery a bit smoother at slower speeds. Personally, this really wasn't something that I massively noticed or bothered me at all. So as you can see, there's literally like the smallest amount. Obviously it's not on at the moment, but the way that the power cuts in, it is quite firm, even at slower speeds and lower in the rev range. So it's got 3 riding modes. It's got the road, the speed, and the rain mode as well. And you still get full power on all of those modes. It just changes how they're delivered, and the mapping is different. So what you would find is that it was more, so on the rain version, for example, which fully utilised on both of those, but I'll save telling you more about that for the Thruxton. The rain version will just basically calm it down a little bit, the acceleration in as you're accelerating, and it won't cut in till a bit later. You can definitely feel a bit of a power band on these as you get up higher into the rev range. It's so torquey, and it will just go. You can be sat at a what speed would I say? Up near the speed limit, definitely not over it, and feel you've still got so much more. It will just go again, and that has made this an awful lot of fun to ride. So as I mentioned about the riding position and the handlebars, they have been pretty comfortable, to be honest, and this entire area has been nice. I've had somewhere to put my quad lock without having to mess about with getting a new one, so that's good. The mirrors, big fan of how these work. There's a lot of bikes that I have ridden that have the arms that you adjust with like the little spanner, and these I love that you can just move them around and adjust them on the road. The shape of them, where they're the more sort of teardrop design, means that you get an even wider field of view, so that is really nice. I do like the styling of having the kind of clip-ons at the end, and even filtering in the city, that hasn't been an issue as far as width goes. The dials on the front, they kind of cover everything that I would want them to without lots of faff. Clearly I need to put some more petrol in, but it's got the buttons that you can circle through different bits of information, and also use this to quite easily change between the 3 rider modes, which I found it does remember which rider mode you were last on. So if you have a week where it's been absolutely hammering it down with rain, you're going to get straight back on to rain mode, which was quite gratefully received, actually. Everything else has been nice and simple to use. I've heard a couple of people mention about it, you know, taking a little, like a bit longer to start up, or, you know, mention some bits around the indicators and them not always going on. This hasn't been something that I personally have experienced. I found that everything has been pretty quick and responsive. Another thing I like is the sound. So I'll just turn it on, so have a listen. It's an idle, then so it sounds pretty nice as standard, but honestly, the time where it sounds its best is when you're roaring through a nice country back road and maybe in a little bit of a higher gear and pull away, and the kind of throaty roar of it is just excellent. So I mentioned before that I've also ridden the 900 and 400, and I wasn't sure how this would feel in terms of being larger, and that the weight was actually very manageable. And it's a 216 kilo bike, which is a bit lighter than I expected it to be honest. I thought it would be more up in the sort of 220 to 230 range, which makes a little bit of a difference, but the weight's also quite low, so it makes it really easy to maneuver it round, and I found that when you're actually on the road, what that does for the handling, because it is heavier than the others, makes it feel so stable. It feels very balanced. It's clear that the build quality is there, and the way that that helps with the balance and the handling is great, but it does feel very stable, and even in some quite high winds, this did a great job, to be honest. And the other thing that matters a lot to me with handling is about the brakes. So that's very important, because as much as you want to go, you also want to stop. And this has got the big Brembo calipers on the brakes. They are very effective. I didn't have any issues with braking, even, you know, emergency stops, things like this. Has handled it really well. And interesting with the tyres, so these are obviously pretty slick, grippy tyres, more designed for nice dry roads, keeping them nice and warm so that they are grippy and you can go quickly. However, even in the rain, these were not an issue. I didn't have any instances of sliding, even with sort of the wet mud on this, so that really impressed me, and I was super happy with that. So loads of things that I like about this one. And talk a bit about the Thruxton, and then we'll come back to some things that maybe I would tweak slightly. So on to the Thruxton RS. Where to begin with this one? Well, it's got to be the design, hasn't it? It looks totally different to the Speed Twin at 1200, and it's certainly something very special. So it's got the chrome mirrored tank, really stands out and is super distinctive, and my gosh, does it look cool. So over the last week, I have been commuting to work on this. I live in the southeast of England in rural Kent, and I work in central London. So it's about an hour and a half to 2 hours, depending on which way you go. And I work in an office, so I need to look somewhat presentable, and it has been absolutely chucking it down for much of the last week. Quite quick winds, very wet, and it's not been the warmest either. So I've needed to get to work, remaining dry, and taking a big backpack full of laptop, clothes, etc. So it means that I have been riding this for a couple of hours each way every day with a big old backpack that weighs probably as much as I do on the back. What I probably should have done is done what Lana did from the channel, so you might have seen her video on this already. She has done quite a lengthy road trip on this bike and has found a way to put luggage on the back. They think she did by taking off the top of this and working some magic with some straps. So that video will tell you a bit more, but I was far too lazy to do any of that, so I just shoved on this giant backpack, which, to be honest, didn't make for the most comfortable ride, because given the riding position, which I'll show you in a moment, paired with that massive backpack, and my back is a little bit sore now we've reached the end of the week, but it really was all worth it. As you can see, it's a little bit covered in mud. Sorry, Triumph, about that, but I had so much fun that I'm not even that sorry. I've been riding it. The first third of my journey is country back roads, so it's been mud, potholes, sliding around a little bit on the racing tyres. Definitely not what they were designed for, but a lot of fun. A third of the journey is motorway and a third is coming into central London. I say a third. On the first day, that third ended up being far longer than it should have been because of something to do with the design on the bars, which I can show you now. So the setup here, I love the way that this is designed in terms of it being a really classic look. However, there was nowhere to put my quad lock, and they do make them. I think my friend who has a Thruxton puts his in the centre. However, I just have the standard one that I'd been really enjoying putting on the Speed Twin. However, as much as I tried to jam it anywhere it might fit, it really didn't want to go anywhere. So in a hurry, I set my Google Maps up to read into my helmet and took a couple of wrong turns and ended up doing a full tour of Lewisham and Peckham, which made me very late for work, but it was worth it. Other thing to note on the handlebars is one of the things that I really love about this bike, and was slightly disappointed to see that this particular version of the Speed Twin didn't have, although I'm sure that you can spec it to have that, is the heated grips. So it's got two different settings. It's got a high and a low version, which you can just cycle through by pressing this button here, and they've been so effective at just keeping my hands nice and warm. It's been a complete game changer, to be honest. Some of the times I've been coming back from London, gone at midnight, and without that my hands definitely would have frozen into some form of wet claw. So super grateful for that as a feature. And then in the same way as the Speed Twin, we've got this nice sort of simplistic, but everything you need is how I would describe it. As far as the dash goes, it's set up in the same way, has the same rider modes. It's got the road, the rain and the sport as well, and I've had the pleasure of enjoying all of those. The rain mode definitely does make a difference, and actually for power delivery, for inner city riding, the rain, the way it dampened the kind of initial acceleration, made it super easy to maneuver in the city. So although that's not technically what the rain mode's for, I did really enjoy it for that as well. So that's good. In a similar area, we have the mirrors. So they work the same way as the ones on the Speed Twin, in that you can maneuver them around just by sort of grabbing them, which super helpful. So he's faffing around with a tool, and I like that these are the little circles. As much as they give slightly less visibility than the teardrop shape that the other bike has, it goes perfectly with the style. So big fan of those. In a similar vein, for things that are just like on the Speed Twin, but I love, brakes. These are also awesome, performed incredibly well in the wet as well, and they needed to do a lot of work in the wet, because to be honest, the commute that I've had this week, it's been tracking it down pretty much constantly, so those have performed really well even on those race tyres. So another thing I considered when deciding to commute on this was the seat and the overall riding position, which I will show you. As in the beginning of the video, I'm still 5'6", so that is what it looks like for me. I have heard from some taller riders that it's potentially slightly less comfortable the taller you get, but I think I'm a pretty good size for this. So riding position, and if you just imagine the biggest backpack you've ever seen on my back, that is what it looks like. And again, if you get your toes up on the pegs, makes for a super sporty riding position. So that has been an awful lot of fun. It does mean that the wind has not been aggressive because you can really get your chest down on the tank at high speeds. The actual seat itself, it's not the most comfortable, but equally I don't think that's what it's designed for. It's not really a tourer and it's not really a commuter. It is for fun, it is for going fast, and it's awesome for that. Having said that, it wasn't enormously uncomfortable, and I say that perhaps a bit generously because my expectations were that it would be so uncomfortable, but it was actually fine. There's not a lot of vibration that comes through the bike, and I think that does make a difference to it. So as much as it's not super squishy and comfortable, it's not got the vibration. And as far as maneuverability goes, it's really thin here, so it makes it nice and easy to move around. And if you're pushing it, then provided you don't do what I do and accidentally melt your waterproofs on the pipes, because I got off of it and decided to maneuver it from standing. If you maneuver it while sitting on it, very easy to maneuver. It's just sub of 200 kilos. I think it's 197. It's nice and low down. The weight's very low down, so super easy to move around. While I'm here, let's have a listen to the sound. Sounds good. So a difference in the Thruxton rather than the Speed Twin is that they have got the Olin shocks. So I was really pleased to see this on the suspension because I've ridden some bikes with this before and had a really good experience of it. It's definitely noticeable that it's an elevation over the ones that are on the Speed Twin. We'll get into those in a minute, but on this I found it was really good. There are a couple of roads of speed bumps, shall we say, and potholes, and you can get a nice jump on this actually, being careful, but these will do really well on the landing. These really good. It was nice and comfortable from that perspective. It didn't feel like the suspension was too hard, kind of either on the front or the rear, so I'm a big fan of those. I mentioned the bike that I rode that had those on before. It was the Norton Commando 961 SP, which, given the similarities in styling, is a bike that a lot of my friends have been asking about a comparison on. So what do I think of this in comparison to what I think of the Norton? So some of you may have seen the video where I talked about my experience doing the Great Mallee Mountain Rally, riding 1,500 miles across the Alps on the Norton Commando. And I can't say I've done as many miles on this, heading up between work and back, but it's certainly enough to give my initial impressions for comparison. And I think I would say one of the really key noticeable differences is around the gearing. So the Norton has got 5 gears, whereas this has got 6. And the way that that works means that this is a lot more forgiving on the ride. I think this is a much easier ride in that sense. The Norton is a bit more of a challenge. You have to put in a bit more work to get out what you want, I think I would say, which I really enjoyed doing, as you'll know if you've seen that video. But this one just felt very easy. It was always there. It did exactly as was asked, and felt very refined in that sense. So that was really lovely. The other big difference was probably around the vibration and the feel. So I mentioned around this not having a significant amount of vibration, and in comparison to the Norton, that is certainly true. There's definitely a lot more vibration coming from the Norton Commando, which, as I mentioned previously, I actually really enjoyed because I think it gave it a real classic feel. There was a little bit of an almost, I want to say clunk in the Norton. but you could certainly feel, it's almost like you could feel it working. It felt very much like a classic in this sense. However, this one, where it's a little bit more gentle, I would say, it doesn't have that kind of feel, which I think for some people, if you don't want the vibration and you don't want that necessarily classic feel in a modern classic in the same way, this will do you better. It's definitely smoother in that sense. Having said that, I could not pick between the two, purely based on the time that I've spent on this, because naturally I'm so attached to the Commando because of how long I spent riding it. But I do think some of the dislikes that people that I know have spoken about of the Norton, those aren't necessarily present in this. At the moment, I personally would still pick the Commando, but this is a very, very excellent bike as well. On to some slightly nitpicky bits. So I mentioned earlier about the suspension, and I have been reading some things online and talking to some friends who've also ridden the Speed Twin, and there are some comments about the kind of the rear shocks, and that they're not as good as the front, certainly, but some people have had like a little bit of a struggle with them, and I have to say, obviously, that's very dependent on firstly how you set them up, which I haven't touched this. This is as it came, and also about your size as well. So I think for me personally, it was only noticeable if I was particularly hard on the bike. So things like potholes in corners and things like that. Otherwise, I didn't have any issues with it, and I certainly wouldn't say I had any issues with it during potholes. It was just noticeable that in comparison to something like the ones on the Thruxton, it wasn't as good. If I were to have one, would I put the Öhlins on? Maybe, but I think that comes down to price, and obviously to keep things at an affordable price point for different things, you do have to make some decisions, and I can understand why that was one that they went with. So that is a slight nitpicky thing. Seat, and perhaps this is me being slightly unfair because it is a sportier one, it's not a cruiser, but I'm comparing it to the Thruxton, which is definitely not designed to be as comfortable. So I think in my head I'm seeing this of, in the garage, this one should be the more comfortable one at the moment, and it's not uncomfortable, but it does have a relatively thin seat, and I think it could be a bit squishier. And again, were I to have one of these bikes, I think the first thing that I would swap out would be to go for a squishier, comfier seat. The one that I had on the Triumph 900 that I rode last summer with the crisscross design, absolutely loved that, the bench seat, and I think I'd maybe go for something like that. You can see it dips down a little bit at the front, partly for the riding position, but I think also it does make it a bit more accessible to shorter riders, which is nice. But I do think it would look awesome with a flat bench seat, so very small thing there. And another one will probably just be the design of the mudguards. I don't know how to describe it. I think maybe it's the colour, maybe it's the length. There's just something about them that I'm just not 100% on, particularly sort of this front one here. I think perhaps if it was black. And then over here on the Thruxton, and actually to be fair, it's the exact same on the Speed Twin, but using this one as the example, just as far as this goes, this is the only little thing I'd change. I have seen some that are just sort of, a little black metal pot or something that are just a bit more subtle rather than sticking out. It doesn't affect the field of view or block anything, but I think just design wise, having this more in keeping with the kind of retro and classic metal look might be a nice move for that. But otherwise on the Thruxton, I'm finding it really hard to nitpick because I've actually had such a good time on it, and I really loved riding it. I think this has been it's just such an excellent bike. I have very little to say. Oh, I've just remembered another thing that was actually kind of fun is the way that these work. They are in such a convenient place. They're completely out of the way of manoeuvring, and also you can kind of play with them in the traffic I've loved this, such a random little thing that I've just remembered, but just wanted to mention. And I've ridden quite a few bikes recently where they've been in the way, and it was so lovely to have something that when you're sat at the light, sort of moving your legs around, completely out the way, where you want them to be. So that's actually another thumbs up as snuck in for the Thruxton, which I think probably says everything you need to know about what my choice is going to be. Something else I did want to mention about the Thruxton is, for some reason, it's being discontinued. So there is a final edition out at the moment, which is a really, really gorgeous green design. And if I were to win the lottery, or if anyone wanted to buy me a very generous birthday present this year, I would be fine to have one of those. I'd be totally okay with it. Really gorgeously designed bike. Those ones are limited, but the rest of the production isn't. So there's not a limited set of numbers of the regular Thruxton available, but they are only available until the end of this year. So if you are interested in getting a Thruxton, I've realised that there's actually quite a limited window to do that. So it might be worth a look if it's something that you're interested in. And overall, I think you can tell that I really love this one. And likewise, the Speed Twin has really, really impressed me. They both have just fantastic build quality that we all come to expect from a Triumph motorcycle. They have performed very well. I've absolutely loved the power of the 1200 Bonneville engine. Very torquey, particularly in the mid-range. Just a lot of fun to ride, handle fantastically, and they've both just given me an excellent experience. So it's clear you get a lot of bike, but how much for? That's something that's really important to me as a young biker, is how much am I going to be spending on these bikes. And both of these are fairly limited edition colorways as far as the Stealth and the Chrome editions go. So these particular bikes that we have here come in at around, we'll put it on the screen, but about 12, 8 and 15 respectively. So there's definitely a bit of a price disparity in there, but not, I don't think, significantly enough that it would change my mind. I think what it really comes down to is what you're using the bike for, and whether or not the particular riding position of the Thruxton is comfortable for you. I have really loved my time on the Speed Twin 1200, but if I had to choose, I've got to go with the Thruxton. Yeah. It's made a very special week commuting to work, is what I can say on that. It's been a wonderful experience testing both of these bikes. So a really big thank you to Triumph for giving me the opportunity to test them for you. And thank you all for watching.